I love the Metroidvania genre. I usually tell people that my favorite is JRPGs, but it really depends on my mood between them and a good Metroidvania. But let's be real here, I'm far from the only person who likes this style of game. In fact, some people like it way more than me. There's a big ass list online of every Metroidvania game, or even games with Metroidvania elements, and god, I couldn't imagine playing all those games. I have enough shit to do as it is. Because even just the ones the original blogger played is just mind-boggling to me. What I haven't gotten out of the genre though is something that I doubt many people will even care about, which is a comprehensive history or a review of each landmark title in the series. I'm talking a long form, I finished a video game style retrospective of the genre, really diving into what makes a Metroidvania, what are its core elements, and what developers have done to make a fairly set in stone genre their own. Someone should really make that. So anyway, this is part 1 of my giant retrospective. Why am I not waiting to release this all-in-one video? Because I'm playing 20 fucking games and I have a full-time job, and I need to put content on this stupid channel or else my self-esteem will plummet further down the rabbit hole. So we get installments instead, which will, at the end, be compiled into a single video. Let's try and keep it under 8 hours, shall we? To hopefully help me accomplish this goal, and also because I actually need to live my life at some point or another, I'm not going to kill myself to 100% most of these games. Especially if I'm not enjoying it, I'm just going to go through the main chunk from beginning to end with light exploration as needed. Some might say that this is antithetical to understanding the appeal of the genre, and if you think that, then we'll just have to agree to disagree. To me, the appeal of the genre is the power progression, not the completion aspect. And before we begin in earnest, let's quickly go over the games we're going to be playing in this retrospective, which we will be doing in order of release. Bam! Now, some of the entries on this list will likely confuse you. While I want to play every major Metroidvania, either a landmark title, an excellent entry within it, or an oddball pick to discover something new, I think it's equally important to look at games with similar elements that don't quite fit the mold. This will help us better define what a Metroidvania even is going forward. And speaking of, here's how I define it. Progression must be made primarily by exploring and finding upgrades in the world, rather than through level ups or quests. And that's quest as in the RPG sense, just so we're clear. This means that main story objectives won't count as quests, as story objectives and exploration will frequently bleed into one another throughout our retrospective. There also, with one exception that I'm aware of at the time of writing this first entry, must be an in-game map that you can use to help navigate the world, even if it sucks. Finally, there must exist an interconnected world to actually explore. I will not be excluding games with multiple separate instanced areas, but I will dock a game points if they have them because they're stupid in a genre like this, even if they make sense in the game's world by themselves. And really, those are my only 3 criteria for what counts as a Metroidvania. This excludes even the original Metroid, which didn't have a map, which is interesting to note at the very least. However, given my experience with today's entry, I do think it's for the best for me if this is as far back as I go into the series. Super Metroid was released for the Super Nintendo in 1994 to near universal acclaim by both contemporary game journalists and audiences. It's labeled as a landmark game in every conceivable way, excelling in atmosphere, tense combat, and was the hallmark of 2D exploration for about 3 years, which, given the fact that A Link to the Past exists, is an amazing feat of development. Many people to this day consider Super Metroid to be one of the greatest games of all time, and it's one of the most popular speedrun games ever, with even its ROM hacks having dedicated speedrun communities. It is a cultural phenomenon, at least in the top 3 biggest and most influential games we will see on our journey. And if you remember the list, you probably know the other 2. It's also not the game for me. And I'm not a contrarian. I know what you're thinking, I'm not a contrarian, but I'll get into this more as we get into the game. In Metroid, the bounty hunter Samus Aran fought Mother Brain and her horde of genetically modified Metroids on Zebes, ultimately defeating Mother Brain, exterminating all but one baby Metroid in the Game Boy sequel Samus Returns, and gives the last baby to scientists so that they can conduct research on it. However, in Super Metroid, that baby is stolen by the resurrected space pirate Ridley and taken back to Zebes with Samus in hot pursuit. Once planetside, the game begins in earnest. Now, compared to many games that we'll be playing later, Super Metroid has just about the most bare-bones story in the world. That opening cutscene and the prologue are all of the narrative context you get for the entire adventure, with only one true story moment happening at the end in the rematch with Mother Brain. Is this a bad thing? Not in the slightest. In a way, it makes Super Metroid one of the most replayable games in our journey, as you can just pick it up and play without having to bother with dialogue, NPCs, or cutscenes. It's just you and the game. So how is that game? Well, if I had to describe Super Metroid's gameplay in one word, by today's standards, it would be clunky. Yes, I admit it, I am spoiled by modern games. But let me just say, I've beaten this game twice now, and I still can't get used to the controls. Samus feels so incredibly heavy, and her airborne lateral movement is so sluggish, and her vertical movement is so sudden, that trying to do any kind of platforming is a chore at best and actively frustrating at worst. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what you do in this game. As we'll see later on, many entries in the Metroidvania genre have a defined aspect that people remember about them. With Aria of Sorrow, they remember the story and the soul system. Ori has a phenomenal soundtrack and tone. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is just so goddamn epic. Super Metroid doesn't really have that. The closest it comes is in its atmosphere, which, while impressive for the time, pales in comparison to the way lighting and soundscapes can be twisted to fit a mood nowadays. In the same way, its exploration and items are classic, yes, but they're also boring even on a first playthrough. As someone who started playing Metroid games with Zero Mission, which is all around just a better version of Super Metroid, there's very little to be excited about that I haven't seen already. And hey, even if I was born in the 80s, the original Metroid had missiles, bombs, the morph ball, the high jump boots, the ice beam, the wave beam, the Varia suit, and the screw attack. That leaves maybe half of the upgrades in Super Metroid to be original, and many of those are either one and done upgrades such as the gravity suit or spring ball, or they're very clunky to use, such as the grappling beam and the charge beam. Really, the only upgrades that I was genuinely excited to get were the Spazer Beam, which made it much easier to hit enemies thanks to the larger shot it provides, and the Space Jump, which broke the game and made it so I barely had to platform anymore, which for me was a positive. To speak about the exploration, while the map is, again, very impressive for its time, it's absolutely puny when comparing it to later entries in the genre. Even if you don't think that's a fair comparison, it does have 3 fatal flaws that bother me to no end, despite its relative complexity, which I want to point out is very welcome. I do ultimately like the map in this game. That said, the visual display of the map that you look at to navigate is terrible. Now, this is going to hold true for quite a while in our journey, as developers hadn't yet figured out how to make the maps coherent and comprehensive for the different aspects of the world. In Super Metroid's case, there's little to no differentiation between a dead end, a one-way door, and a two-way door, as well as no indication for the different colors of door that you might want to check out with later upgrades. For my purposes, this made the in-game map basically useless. I had no issue justifying using an online map with everything I needed on it. Since I already knew where I had to go and in roughly what order I had to do it, all I needed the map for was to know what lines were walls and which ones were doors, which cut down on my frustration immensely. The second issue with the exploration is the lack of fast travel, which made backtracking a massive chore throughout the entire game, and oh boy, does this game make you backtrack. Perhaps for a more skilled player, they could simply zip from one area to the next with no issue, but for me, I was constantly taking detours and going back to earlier areas to get inventory upgrades or energy tanks to simply survive. Remember, we're looking at this from a casual first time or second time player perspective. We're not going for all the sequence breaks or the speed run strats or anything like that. I don't know how many missiles I'm gonna need to beat Ridley. You know what I mean? The lack of fast travel itself is not an issue whatsoever, but along with the janky movements that I was usually stuck deep into an area to get those upgrades, and that I would have to waddle my way back out to get to my next objective, implementing such a system would just be the simplest solution to the core problem that the movement system in Super Metroid is unfun and unsatisfying the vast majority of the time. If more rooms allowed you to speed boost through them and see the flashing colors, then that would be one thing. Instead, you waddle ever so slowly and leap like a frozen cow from one tiny platform to the next, and each one was agony. The third big problem is perhaps the most critical flaw with the entire game, and its issues seep into almost every other aspect of play, including combat, bosses, and the feeling of progression, which is oftentimes the cornerstone of the entire genre. And that issue is that there's next to no exciting loot to find as you explore the world. Each major upgrade is found at the end of a relatively long linear path through a level, which is often adjacent to a few optional paths to make it seem more non-linear than it is. The first few upgrades are your core kit that you'll be using to get around the entire game. Morph ball, bombs, missiles, super missiles, high jump boots, and power bombs. From there, every optional path or challenge leads to an inventory upgrade for your missiles, super missiles, or power bombs, or an energy or reserve tank. After a certain point, these pickups stop being worth the effort to obtain them. And when that's all of the optional pickups that you can find, it makes exploration feel incredibly arbitrary. This kind of system can work if the main draw is in the execution of the exploration. The Ori duology is a great example of this that we'll be getting into near the end of our retrospective. And if you think that comparison is unfair because there's a big time jump, the same could be argued for Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, a full console generation earlier than this. Its combat alone was more mechanically engaging than any of Super Metroid's various systems, and made exploration punishing but incredibly rewarding in the same way that beating an optional boss in Dark Souls is. The reward is giving the player the opportunity to push their limits and overcome adversity. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for Super Metroid. Its platforming challenges are dreadful to execute. Let's take a look at this relatively simple challenge in Norfair. You enter a room from the left and you have small platforms to jump on. When you get close to them, they sink to the ground and in the range of fire of these statues that shoot fireballs. All you have to do is jump across the platforms, shoot this door open, and get inside. Seems simple enough, right? But look at this. Look at how jerky and awkward it is to make these jumps. And with them sinking and the fireballs harassing you, it makes everything so needlessly annoying. Not difficult, just annoying. The last jump especially is frustrating because you have to wait for the platform to sink before you can jump so that you don't bonk your head on the outcropping. It's infuriating, and every time you fail, you have to go back into the prior room to clamber back up to the starting point, and you're harassed by enemies on the way that can easily drain your resources if you're not careful. It's ridiculous. And the missile pack you get for it, at least before the grappling beam, is so not worth it. But you don't know that on a first playthrough. You just think, oh, this is an optional challenge. There must be something good back here, right? But no, it's just a missile pack. And the worst part is that these pickups are entirely necessary, and that's all to do with the boss design of Super Metroid. In a word, and I do think this is even fair for the time, it's terrible. In the early days of the video game scene, there were no quality standards or deep analyses and understanding of mechanics, which ultimately pushed the medium into its more refined modern state. As such, it's expected to have a lack of polish in these older games, and the well-known concept of retro jank is present in almost any old school game you'll ever play. And that's fine, that's part of the charm of going back to these older generations, but one of the more annoying features of this retro jank is a lack of understandable and reactable patterns, a great example of which is present here in Super Metroid. There are 5 true bosses in this game: Kraid, Phantoon, Dragon, Ridley, and Mother Brain, which, depending on my mood, is the only one I would consider to be a true boss in the entire game, with a scattering of mini-bosses throughout the world which often have more sound design by modern standards than the actual bosses. The first one you'll fight is Kraid, who guards the Varia suit, which will allow you to explore Norfair for the first time with its heat resistance properties. Things start out relatively simply, with you firing a super missile into his mouth, but then things go off the rails. All at once, you suddenly have to fight Kraid on 2 floating platforms. By itself, this wouldn't be an issue. However, this is where those unreactable or unpredictable patterns come in. A common theme with the boss fights in this game are randomly shooting projectiles. Some, like the detached spikes which slide along the second level of the arena, are perfectly fine assuming that they move at a consistent rate. However, the flying claws seem to be completely random, and it's just bad form to force you to focus on baiting Kraid to open his mouth over and over to shoot missiles into it while also focusing on the projectiles. Things are made even worse when getting hit is so potentially punishing, as you're likely to fall right back down onto the first floor spikes and take double damage from one mistake. And there's no guarantee that you'll have a clean jump back up onto the 2 platforms, potentially resulting in another hit and another trip back into the spikes below. It's just frustrating when I don't feel like I performed any better or worse, yet on my first attempt I died, and on the second attempt, Kraid lasted about 10 seconds before he was dead. Unfortunately, the same idea holds true for the other 4 bosses in the game. Phantoon has a mechanic where he stays invisible most of the time, and the opportunity to attack is incredibly small. Along the way, you have to dodge or shoot the fire globs it drops. That's fine, but it drops them faster than you can shoot them sometimes. As well, there's one particular attack that I wasn't able to find a consistent remedy for, where it spirals fire in a clockwise and then a counterclockwise fashion over and over. And while this fight didn't have any annoying stage hazards, Phantoon hits way harder than Kraid did, so it's arguably even worse. However, I think my least favorite boss is Dragon, because it's a puzzle boss that doesn't ever tell you that it's a puzzle boss. At no point did the wrecked ship zone ever tell the player that enemies could be damaged by electrical stage hazards, and that was a whole level ago anyway, and yet here in Meridia, a completely different area by the way, the intended way to beat Dragon is to let it hit you to bait out its grab attack, let it grab you and sting you a fuck ton, and then hope that you can use the grappling beam to lock Dragon to the electrical wall and kill him instantly. I died on this fight probably 5 times before I finally looked it up and discovered this puzzle, and I beat him the hard way on my first playthrough anyway, and I hated it there, so it's ridiculous. The second biggest issue with Dragon, and the biggest with Ridley, is that the camera doesn't show enough of the area to have this darting attack thing come from the boss. You simply don't have enough time to react to anything any of them do. And the result is that most casual players are just going to damage tank their way through encounters rather than actually overcome them. And when this doesn't work, they're going to get frustrated. And if you're wondering, the biggest issue with Dragon are the projectiles that fire from the wall, which deal like 50 damage a pop, even with the gravity suit. The story with Ridley is the next verse, same as the first. Samus is too big in frame and Ridley is too big and flies away too fast. There's added insult this time around though, as if any part of your shot touches Ridley's tail, the entire thing is negated. This makes the spacer especially annoying to use thanks to its large hitbox, and basically means that you have to maximize your missile and super missile usage if you want to stand a chance. This is the pattern that permeates through the bosses, a bunch of unpredictable or excessive projectiles harassing you where you have to use missiles and super missiles, which means you have to go around and grab these boring ass pickups to expand your inventory or be stuck using the near useless charge beam. Plus, the general frustration in the arena design. Not a single one of these main bosses were enjoyable for me. If I had to pick a favorite, I would say Ridley, with my least favorite being Dragon, but if we're being honest, the only structured encounter I enjoyed was Crocomire, and that's just barely the case. However, once you defeat Kraid in Brinstar, Phantoon in the wrecked ship, Dragon in Meridia, and Ridley in Norfair, the golden statues found in Crateria lead the way to the final area in the game, Turian. There, you'll discover the fate of the baby Metroid that you've been pursuing all this time. It grew up, and though it takes a while to realize, it spares Samus thanks to it imprinting on her. Continuing on, you'll find a resurrected Mother Brain who has a monstrous new second form, which is the only boss in the game with both recognizable patterns and no bullshit projectiles or stage hazards to deal with, so good fight. After dealing enough damage, Mother Brain will unleash a massive beam attack which basically one-shots you, but this is scripted. The baby Metroid absorbs the life force of Mother Brain and implants it into Samus, only to be struck down in the process. Now with a new Hyper Beam, Samus defeats Mother Brain and escapes the planet before it explodes. The end. So, to recap, Samus goes to this planet to rescue the baby Metroid, which she fails at. She also kills Mother Brain and her entourage, but she also did that in the first game, and they're back now, so who's to say they won't return again? So basically, the entire game was for nothing, save for killing off the rest of the Metroid species, with no research done into them like was planned. Neat. Overall, for me at least, there's nothing really to look forward to that would drive me to go to the next area of the game. I wasn't impressed by the atmosphere or environments because I'm a modern gamer and have better options at this point, which I know it's not fair. You don't need to tell me in the I get it. I get it. I'm looking at it from a contemporary perspective. I'm not looking at it from a traditional. I get it. You don't need to tell me. Anyway. The combat and movement are clunky at best, and the exploration is dreadfully dull with terrible rewards that are unfortunately necessary for casual players. So, do I think Super Metroid is a good game? Absolutely yes. I may have done nothing but complain throughout this entire video, but there's no denying the influence and the craft compared to the times that this game can boast of. Like I said at the start of this video, it's just not the game for me. I think it has a lot of flaws, but if you like it, either for what it is or because of nostalgia, I'm never going to try and take that away from you. Please enjoy it because God knows someone has to. For our purposes in this retrospective, Super Metroid introduced a lot of the hallmarks of what would eventually be known as the Metroidvania genre. A map that fills in as you explore, optional paths and challenges that lead directly to upgrades and rewards, distinct zones which have their own aesthetics and unique gameplay scenarios to play through, and though it isn't as pronounced as some other games in the genre, a twist ending that serves to recontextualize the rest of the game. But as it is the first game to introduce all of these elements, it does so in perhaps the roughest form we'll ever see, even if it deserves the highest praise for doing so. At the very least, Super Metroid is a game worth playing to see where the genre it birthed all started, or at least where it was conceived, because in the end, Super Metroid had to walk so that Castlevania Symphony of the Night could run. I'll see you guys in the next video.